I love the story of Pandora's box. This box has a story with it. My grandfather was born in 1906, and he was the seventh generation of his men, of men in his family, to go to sea as merchant sailors. And this is a box that he picked up. It's unmarked, but the design and the artistry indicates that it was probably Persian Gulf, Middle East. I know that he worked on oil tankers, so he spent a lot of time in the Gulf. And he would bring back things for my grandmother and my aunt and my father. And I believe that this is olive wood and sandalwood and some others. And there's some mother of pearl stuff in here with the inlay is just exquisite. It's probably from Syria. I have some other things that he brought back from that area, and from what we now call Israel, but before it was Israel. It was in the 1930s and 40s where he did some of that work. So, memory lane addressed. So Pandora's box. There is so much complexity and subtlety and irony wrapped up in that tale that it sometimes reads like an episode of Norman Lear's All in the Family TV program. And like that classic program, many people miss the biting commentary contained within. This is ancient Greek culture's version of the human creation story, in which the Hebrew version has a similar story. God created a mate for Adam, but with strings attached. I give you this paradise and this companion, and the only catch is don't eat the fruit from this tree. Eve, like Pandora, is curious and cannot resist the allure of the unknown and the forbidden. It is curiosity of the two women that unleash all the troubles of the world in both versions of that old story. I remember a time when I was in Washington, D.C. for a conference, an AFL-CIO conference. I was in a trade union at a time. And the keynote speakers on that day were Maxine Waters and Ann Richards. You know who Ann Richards is? She had recently lost her seat to the Texas governor's seat, to that other guy, George W. something or other. And I remember Ann Richards, she was amazing. She was absolute dynamite in a teeny tiny little, absolutely unthreatening looking packet. She was maybe this tall, and then she had maybe this much hair. And very quiet seeming and with just dead timing. It was amazing. And I remember she said something to the effect of, if a woman decides not to have children and to earn a living to support herself, she is selfish and ambitious. If she has children and stays home to take care of them, then she is lazy. But if she goes to work and puts the children in childcare, then she is a heartless and an unfit mother. She said, not since Adam said, Eve made me do it, have women taken so much blame for the world's troubles. It is worth noting that when men write history, women get the blame for a lot of things. A different view of that old story might note that the men's lack of curiosity would have permitted the world's history to be filled with uninteresting stories and no advancement or learning. The status quo was comfortable, so why change it? And hope is complex. Hope, like joy, requires another side to the coin. And the opposite of hope, I believe, is not despair, but resignation. It's a belief that nothing can be done. But hope inspires us to do things, to challenge things, to explore. In an episode of Star Trek's The Next Generation, there was an episode called The Masterpiece Society. And the crew of the Starship Enterprise encountered a place called the Moab 4. It was a reclusive colony that originally had left the Earth in effort to create a perfect society through genetic engineering. They created a world without scarcity, without poverty or prejudice or discrimination or infirmity. There was no disability and no disease, a perfect existence. This is a clear reference to eugenics. Gene Roddenberry was never known for being subtle. And this planet was at risk for being struck and destroyed by a stellar core fragment, whatever that is, spinning through space and headed for them. The technology of the planet's genetically engineered culture was unable to contend with this kind of threat. And the people were willing to accept help from the Enterprise crew, despite them being quite imperfect. There is discussion in the episode about the visor technology worn by Commander Jody LaForge, who was, in the storyline, born blind. But his visor does more than simply permit him to see, it enables him to see the full spectrum of colors, including infrared and ultraviolet, and whatever other spectrums might exist beyond our human ability to extrapolate and comprehend. On this planet, Moab 4, he would not have been permitted to live or even be born with such a disability. And it was precisely the lack of adversity that prevented this culture from developing the kind of science necessary to solve problems, or enable folks who have differing levels of ability to participate fully as valued, productive members of society. And it was the technology behind Geordi's visor that was key to Moab 4's salvation. With LaForge's visor and his technical brilliance, they were able to boost the power of the tractor beam in a way that could save the planet from destruction by a chunk of space flotsam that threatened to destroy them. Starship Enterprise Captain Picard denounced genetic engineering as removing uncertainty from life, and as such, stifling things like wonder and curiosity and creativity. The episode ends with some number of the Moabites seeking refuge on the Enterprise to explore the universe around them, while presumably those who remained on Moab 4 were left to grapple with the knowledge that their efforts to create a perfect society had instead created a society that lags far behind much of the rest of the universe in technology, philosophy, and the arts. So last week I spoke about inviting joy into our lives. Today we're talking about hope. And a person's ability to hope often relies on one's understanding of humanity. Is humanity inherently good or bad? Will good things happen, or are pain and difficulty our lot in life? For me, the answer to that question is yes. People are inherently good. In some way, shape, or form, each of us, that's everybody, deserves love, deserves joy, deserves salvation and compassion and grace. And pain and difficulty happen. Our world is not genetically engineered, thank goodness, And so there is uncertainty, there are challenges, and yes, there are truly terrible things that happen. And there are people who allow or even cause them to happen. That is one of the downsides to having free will. Some will misuse it, and that abuse means pain for others. In much of Christianity, which we acknowledge as foundational in our origin story, there is a perverse notion that all suffering is to teach some kind of deep or grand lesson. Pain teaches us patience. It teaches us how to rely on others, teaches us humility and lessons in resilience and all manner of traits we consider desirable in human beings. That is toxic theology, and it is crap. Suffering is not how we get closer to God. Suffering is suffering. It is universal, it is unfair, and it is bad. Nobody is picked out by the universe for torture or subjugation, although humans will do that to one another at an alarming rate. Trauma is not a gift that teaches us deep life lessons. No. Trauma messes with our brain chemistry and gives us weird coping skills that don't work in other situations. See? Just like that. Betrayal is not an opportunity to develop trust or forgiveness. Betrayal is betrayal. It is painful and disappointing and sad and wrong. These things are part of the lived experience, however, and religions down through the ages have sought to explain them in myriad ways. I have heard people say about a friend's cancer diagnosis, "This is meant to teach us something." No, it isn't. No, it isn't. This hardship is hardship. Cancer is cancer. It is a horrible and painful and awful in 1,000 ways. If you develop skills or behaviors that help you survive it, that's great, but that is not the purpose of cancer, to teach us some grand piece of serene wisdom. A few years ago, I attended a retreat at Earth 2. It was a biosphere outside of Tucson. I'm seeing my scientist people go, yeah, I know that. Located in the middle of the desert, the biosphere is a giant geodesic dome of glass panels. It was an experimental thing from decades ago to see how humans might survive in a sealed terrarium of sorts. It's not wrong. It's not wrong. A team of scientists with a variety of useful life skills were sealed inside of this thing for a period of years. Their job was to cultivate their own food, grow enough plants to produce sufficient oxygen and nutrition to keep them all alive, and study how every living thing inside the dome behaved in that isolation. Scientists outside the dome monitored things like O2 levels and the temperature and biodata of the researchers, but they did not interfere with how the people inside the dome were living. There are volumes filled with the data collected from that experiment, but the biggest lesson I took away from touring that facility was from the trees. Without disease, in a perfectly designed environment, with enough water and sunlight and nutrition, the trees in the dome grew and then snapped off. They were unable to support their own weight because they did not have the strength that other trees developed from being exposed to the forces of nature. Wind and rain and sunshine. That movement, that input allowed the trees outside to develop stronger than the trees in this terrarium. Wind and rain and sun do more than feed the tree nutrients. It turns out that they forced the tree to develop strength to withstand the same wind and sun and rain, even as those things nurtured the plant. Without something to resist, the trees could not develop the strength they needed and grew tall, but were as spindly and fragile as blades of grass. Adversity is not always a bad thing. This summer, we were reminded how important hope is to our mental and spiritual health. Those of us on the liberal side of politics went into the summer feeling low. We had a presidential candidate who was aging and clearly past his prime. We loved him, but there seemed to be no one who could explain to him that it was time to step away. July 21st changed all that. I left this building after preaching, feeling okay, if not great, about the service. I had given a half-hearted bit of support for this aging lion of liberal politics, but I did not have much hope for the future. If I am to be honest, I was wondering how I might survive a fascist regime that seemed destined to take over. When I got into my car and turned on the radio, all that changed. The aging candidate had dropped out of the race and the vice president would be endorsed within minutes. And when I say everything shifted, I mean everything. My brain got an initial blast of adrenaline at the shock, and then wave after wave of dopamine flooded in as I allowed myself to imagine the future in a new way. No longer was I resolved to a grim fate, but there was something to hope for. All those terrible things were out of Pandora's box and flying around, creating misery. But now there was this tiny little thing at the bottom, this battered, mangled little sparkly butterfly of a fairy, like Tinkerbell with feathers, as Emily Dickinson describes, that escaped and flew around in my brain, spreading joy and hope. Watching the nation react to that event and to the outpouring of positive energy afterwards, I was aware of how desperately this nation needed hope. We drank that stuff up like we were starving. We needed that glimmer of hope far more than we could ever have imagined. Suddenly, things were possible that had seemed out of reach just hours before. There was a chance that the would-be dictator now might not win. There was an opportunity for new ideas, new energy, new leadership. Honestly, those among us who are Gen X were kind of like, wow, one of us. And then somebody identified them not as Gen X, but as Gen, what's the word? Some other thing, but not Gen X, just because she's 1 year back. Anyway, Gen X, we still claim her. So there was an opportunity for Pandora's redemption. Yes, there's rotten stuff in the world, but don't forget it was Pandora who brought forth hope. Zeus was a miserable god, insecure and mean. He was a bully. He set up Pandora and all humans to suffer the evils contained in the box. But it was Pandora who allowed hope to escape her little prison and take an edge off all of Zeus's cruelty. Hope is not a state of unthinking positivity. It does not ignore the grim reality in its belief that something positive will come. Hope understands that life has its ups and downs, and that ups and downs will come again. But hope knows that pain is not forever, that injustice will not stand, and that love will win in the end. Hope also understands that change requires action on our part. We cannot expect change to come by simply sitting in the mire of our sadness and waiting for some miracle to happen. Hope requires us to fight back, to engage, to say, oh, hell no, that's not going to happen here, not on my watch. And as much as I love Emily Dickinson's idea of hope as a thing with feathers that comes to light upon us gently in the sunshine, I find another poet's description of hope to be a little more realistic, or at least a little more understandable to my cynical tendencies. This is a piece from My Broken Voice, Poetry from the Edge and Back by Caitlin Seda, published in 2018. And it is written directly in response to Emily Dickinson's pastoral vision of hope. Hope is not a bird, Emily, it's a sewer rat, by Caitlin Seda. Hope is not a thing with feathers that comes home to roost when you need it most. Hope is an ugly thing with teeth and claws and patchy fur that's seen some shit. It's what thrives in the discards and survives in the ugliest parts of our world, able to find a way to go on when nothing else can even find a way in. It's the gritty, nasty little carrier of such diseases as optimism, persistence, perseverance, and joy, transmissible as it drags its tail across your path and bites you in the ass. Hope is not some delicate, beautiful bird, Emily. It's a lowly little sewer rat that snorts pesticides like they were lines of coke and still shows up on time to work the next day, looking no worse for wear. I understand that hope. However it is that you understand hope, I encourage you to embrace it this week and in the 6 weeks ahead of us between now and the election. Invite hope in, embrace it, hug it, buy it a drink and a sandwich, nurture it, feed it, and then get to work with it, doing whatever it is that you can to bring about the world we all so desperately want to exist. May hope be our practice and our prayer, today, tomorrow, and always. Amen.